Hey everybody, this is GRE Bites. My name is Davis. I'm an educator with over 10 years of experience.
And I'm Orion, the founder of StellarGRE.
We're here to bring you your weekly bite-sized episode on GRE prep and grad school admissions. For more information, check us out at StellarGRE.com. Okay, so we've spent some episodes in the weeds. We've spent some episodes in broad picture, zoomed out. I want to understand we've talked about time and time-taking strategies, mental strategies before, but I want to look at it from a different angle this time, specifically on the quant section. Is there a way to get ahead of the curve, to not always feel like you're rushing, to not always feel like, oh, I don't have enough time to really give this question what I need, let me skip around or whatever. So is it possible to create a feeling, and how, of oh, I'm ahead of the clock, I'm ahead of my time schedule?
It definitely is possible to get that feeling on the GRE quant section, and it's really important because one of the primary drivers of carelessness is the subjective sense of urgency, this feeling that I don't have enough time to answer this question, and I have to keep moving. That sort of internal pressure is just a breeding ground for small careless errors, which is really the bugbear of high scorers, where they know how to answer all of the questions, but they are not yet getting the score that they would desire because of small, insignificant mistakes that they're making, right? They're actually not so insignificant. The carelessness is the hardest thing to fix on the GRE. It can be fixed, but it's usually the last thing to be fixed. Okay, so how can we feel like we're ahead of the clock, which will reduce this subjective sense of urgency, which will mitigate our carelessness and help us have a better and more positive experience with the test? Well, first of all, I recommend skipping around on the quantitative section. Basically, we want to take 2 passes through each set, and if a question pops up and it meets one of our skipping criteria, we're just going to save that for the second pass through. We're not even going to read it or consider it now. We're just going to skip and move on. And my skipping criteria they revolve around not whether a question is difficult or not, because it takes time to determine a question's difficulty level. We have to read it, we have to think about it, something has to not work, we have to try something else that has to not work.
It's just a specific diagnostic on this type of question, skip.
Yeah, because some questions are going to be inherently more time consuming than other questions, simply as a consequence of how they're presented on the test. These are things like paragraph long word problems. Maybe the math isn't hard, but it's going to take you a minute just to get down to the question mark. So, there are questions that you can solve in less than a minute.
So that's a really interesting thing, just to make that concrete a little bit. A paragraph word question, it's one question. It's the same value. It's the same value of points in your end score as another question that is a plug and chug.
Yeah,
something like that. But if you can do 3 plug and chugs in the same time, it would take you to do 1 paragraph word question. It makes a lot of sense from that higher level looking at it. Skip the paragraph one first, get those 3 points out earlier.
Then you're deeper into the test.
Then if you have time, you can go back for that 1 point instead of spending your time at the first pass.
Yeah, and you should have time. But that's absolutely right. So we want to skip defensively, which is basically like we're going to skip the big time-consuming questions on our first pass, so that we can answer the questions that we stand the highest likelihood of answering correctly quickly first on our first pass through. And there's generally about 1/3 of the questions in any given quantitative set meet one of my skippable criteria. And so we're going to answer about 2/3 of the questions on our first pass through. And that will we will have gotten through most of the questions while we're still in the deep, we still have plenty of time left on the clock. And so we'll also know exactly how much time we have left for exactly how many questions, which will also help us to pace ourselves more appropriately on our second pass through. So again, this skipping strategy is mostly defensive because it prevents students from expending too much time on the first pass through on questions that that time could be spent answering 2 or 3 more efficient problems. And so you're going to feel like you're ahead of the clock because you will have answered 15 problems in 20 minutes instead of maybe only 10 if you're just doing the questions sequentially.
But just to tie that together, that makes a lot of sense too, because say you do you don't practice the skipping method. You're not skipping defensively and organizing your time that way. You blow a couple minutes on a word problem that was just a little tricky to parse out. And then now you have that subjective sense of urgency on these three other easy questions, and you can make careless errors there, where if you did those first with all the clock ahead of you, you're much less likely to have the careless errors. But I want to talk a little bit about, I want to ask you about this last part, which you said, okay, if you get through these 2/3 of the questions, then you can better, you have a better sense of like how to allot your time for the remaining section. How important is that internal perception of like, how am I using my time? How am I going to allot my time?
Timing is super important on this test. It's the most, I think it's the most difficult component of the GRE is the time pressure. And the clock will be ticking away second by second in the upper right-hand corner of the test, which I find to be nerve-wracking and distracting. So there's a couple things that I do. First of all is I toggle the timer off. I don't like seeing it tick down second by second. I find it distracting. I find it anxiety-provoking. That said, I can't ignore it entirely because it's a time test. I can't pretend that that's not a constraint. So what I do is I check in with the time limit every 5 problems. 5 problems is a quarter of the set. A quarter of the time is about 8 or 9 minutes. So I check in every 5 problems to see if I'm where I am relative to being about 8.5 minutes deeper into the set. If I do 5 problems and I've only spent 7 minutes, it's like,
Feel great.
Yeah, I have some, I can, chill out. I've banked a couple of minutes. I'm ahead of the clock. Makes me feel good. If for whatever reason I check in on the timer and I'm 10 minutes in, okay, well, it's not the end of the world, but I clearly can't keep that pace up and get to all the questions in the time limit. So checking in at this frequency allows me to course correct if and when I need to, because that's, helps me attend to the reality of the test.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So if you can get through what's just in on average, if you get through 2/3 of the test, you're skipping those skippable questions for the second pass.
Yeah.
And you're looking at the clock. After 2/3 of the problems, are you about halfway through the time?
Yeah, ideally, this might not happen right away, but what I usually tell students is we're going to take 2 passes through each quantitative set. We're going to do the first 2/3 of problems we don't skip right then and there. And ideally, those 2/3 of problems we complete in about 20 minutes. That obviously reserves the final 15 minutes for the inefficient 1/3 of problems we did skip. If you do the math, these inefficient problems get more time per question, like prorated, which they need because they're inefficient. But they get the minority of minutes, only 15 versus 20, which is important because they're the minority of points. Like you mentioned, these time-consuming problems aren't worth more than the quantitative comparison questions that you can generally do in less than a minute. So it's important to get as many points as we can while we still feel like there's plenty of time on the clock, because that will allow us to be cool, calm, and collected, reduce our carelessness, and get the points that we deserve to get.
Do you also reserve a time? I know you've spoken, this is a little tangential to the focus of this episode, but is there also, do you reserve a minute or so at the end to say, okay, any questions that I haven't gotten to yet, let me go throw in an answer, because you can't get penalized for wrong?
Yeah, that's a good question. So generally, what I do, best practices, is when I decide to skip a problem, I put in a placeholder answer.
Okay.
I hit mark, which is like this little red flag in the toolbar, so I can go back there very easily on my second pass, and then I just move on to the next problem. So it's a 3-click flow. Placeholder, mark next, placeholder, mark next. It takes a second.
And you're doing that on your first pass.
That's right, because worst case scenario, I lose track of time where it gets away from me, the section just ends. Now everything at least has an answer. So I don't have to stop what I'm doing when there's 30 seconds left and in this, harried, frenetic fashion. It's like everything has been taken care of. And I know it's a placeholder because I've marked it, and that also allows me to go back to those questions very quickly using the review function in the toolbar. So I don't have to just go forwards and backwards sequentially through the problems. But there's one more thing I want to mention, which is that we can kind of get ahead of the clock by skipping offensively. So we've talked about like skipping defensively. Let's not spend our time on the time-consuming questions on our first pass throughs, like we're protecting our time. But we can also skip aggressively.
Okay.
offensively. Because there are certain types of problems that are easy to recognize that in the vast majority of cases you can solve in 60 seconds or less. And these are questions with variables and the answer choices. These are plug-in problems. And there's usually going to be 4 or 5 of them per problem set. It's like 20 to 25% of the test, the quantitative test. If you just skip through the set looking for variables and the answer choices, you can skip offensively.
And you just get those done first.
Yeah, because I'll skip, variables. Within 2 seconds, I know that I'm plugging in. I can start by plugging x is 2 as y is 3, and I can generally solve these problems in 45 seconds, 60 seconds. And if I can solve 5 questions in 5 minutes, that's a huge game changer, because I've just finished a quarter of the test in like a seventh of the time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's huge. So that's a way that you can bank a lot of time right out of the gate by skipping offensively. But that's a more advanced strategy. Students should only do that once they've mastered the defensive skipping, because that's more important in the early stages.
And just clarification, when you skip offensively within that first pass, you're not necessarily, because you're going for the speed there, you're not necessarily, if you're skipping problems, are you doing that 3-click flow?
No, if I'm skipping offensively, because it's the first 5 minutes, I know I'm not going to be running out of time.
Yeah.
That's not a danger here.
Yeah.
So I just am
You're just
burning through looking for variables
those
and the answer
ones and
choices,
just getting those done.
and then plugging in as quickly as possible, and hopefully I can get 5 points in 5 minutes.
That one key thing to point out here is that with this strategy, what I've noticed is that then you get in a flow. If you're specifically skipping just in this offensive way, you get in the flow of, I know I'm just doing plug-in exercises, and then it's just, you've got, instead of switching between different diagnostic strategies, you're just, I'm going to do all these first.
That's a great point,
Yeah.
because one of the hardest things about the test is that the questions, you don't know what type of questions they are. You don't know what their diagnoses are. You don't know their difficulty. The test is not in ascending order of difficulty, so you do have to spend time on the front end trying to figure out just what you're dealing with. And if you know I'm just going to be doing plugging in because I'm looking for this one very common diagnostic type, yeah, you should be able to solve those questions way more efficiently than if they're mixed up with other problem types. That's a good point. Yeah.
That's great.
Okay.
Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another episode of GRE Bites. If you have any topic you'd like to see discussed on a future episode, please reach out, StellarGRE@gmail.com. And as always, if you're interested in GRE prep or grad school consulting, please visit StellarGRE.com. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening, guys.